Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, just hours before President Donald Trump was to visit El Paso, Texas, almost 700 migrants were arrested. And this attack, of course, that took place in El Paso, Texas, the reason why, of course, Trump was to visit that area was that a man linked to an online screed about a Hispanic invasion had shot at least 22 people dead for that very reason. Now, U.S. immigration officials say they've temporarily released around 300 of those migrants that they had detained in those raids, in large part to ensure, according to ICE that is, that their children were properly cared for. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Sascha Auerbach, who is a U.S. affairs expert. He's a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined by Ariel Ramirez-Stich, who is a political analyst. She focuses on Latin America and has spent some of her childhood, in fact, in El Paso, Texas itself, where her parents still reside, and she's joining us now from Edinburgh. Ariel and Sascha, thank you both for joining us. Ariel, I wanted to get your thoughts first. Firstly, of course, about your thoughts about the shooting to begin with that took place in El Paso, and secondly, about Trump's visit, and third, about these raids that took place there.
Well, I'm happy to share that with you. And the thing is, I want to reiterate first the sentiments coming from my hometown, and similarly to my own, is that this is not someone who knew our community in any way. This was someone from outside who was, I guess, radicalized by these ideologies of some sort of invasion of Hispanics, came to a place where he knew there would be a large population of Mexican Americans, if not other Hispanic groups in the United States. El Paso is over 85% Hispanic, and we are very proud of that fact. My heritage has long roots in El Paso. My mother's family has been there for generations. And we're all very happy to share our culture and share what we think makes us special as El Pasoans. It's a beautiful place, beautiful nature, really warm, welcoming city. And we are sort of lucky in the fact that many of the, instances of violence in our sister city of Juarez, Mexico, never made it across the border. It was a very safe place. As a child, I felt always really very comfortable being outside late at night. Never any issues of that sort. So it has been...
Ariel, if I may come in for a moment, because, all of what you've described, if I were to put that on side and play devil's advocate for the other side just for a moment, the argument would be, as you well know, of course, this argument that America is a country of law and order, and people need to follow the laws, even those who are coming into the country as migrants or otherwise. How do you respond to that argument where if somebody has come in illegally, is living in the U.S. illegally, that there needs to be some way to deal with that situation, isn't there?
I think the first statement is there's no such thing as someone being illegal. There are laws we have in place to regulate the flow of immigration, and that's understandable. But if you look at the historic roots of our country, it was a bunch of people from Europe and the UK fleeing persecution, fleeing religious troubles and other economic woes that really created what we know today to be the United States. And I don't think a couple of hundred years and a geographic designation really changes the heart of what America was founded on.
Okay, Sascha, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Then, what do you make of all of this? Not just, of course, in the context of El Paso, but this entire argument about how now ICE is carrying out these raids, the ramifications on innocent children, etc.
Well, I think that's a very good way to put it, which is what are the humanitarian implications to these policies? Obama, for example, has largely abandoned these large-scale workplace raids because it was bad press and it was a very aggressive form of immigration enforcement. And ironically enough, these raids often grab the wage earner of a household, leaving the dependents at home bereft, so creating an even greater problem in terms of want and poverty in those regions. The fact that Trump is returning to them is very much in line with the rhetoric that he has used to mobilize his base, which is I'm going to arrest illegal immigrants, I'm going to deport them as quickly as possible. So he's following through on these campaign promises and promises that he's now reiterated as he runs for re-election. It's just the timing of it was terrible for him because these operations take months to put together, and this one happened to come to fruition right after the consequences of his highly racialized rhetoric were made, I think, very evident in the El Paso shooting.
Okay, so Sascha, I'll put to you the same argument that I put to, because I think it's one which doesn't get enough airtime to be discussed, and that is about and in this case, I'll quote the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Mississippi. They said that the reason why these 300 people were released temporarily was so that they could take care of their children. So there was an effort put in overall to try to take care of the human rights, quote unquote, of these people, and of course the rights of the children to not be separated from their parents. They all said that these steps were taken after extensive planning, as you alluded to as well, of course, in your answer there. Is that enough of a defense, do you think? Did the U.S. Attorney's Office, did ICE carry out their duties properly?
Well, I think that's a very good question. ICE, regardless of how one may feel about it ideologically or professionally, is essentially a civil service organization. You can't blame the agency themselves for taking the actions that they did. I think the real question we have to ask is twofold. Number one, is this policy effective? Are these large workplace raids really addressing whatever issues one chooses to identify in terms of migration to the U.S., in terms of illegal employment in the U.S., or is it more of a publicity stunt? The other question you have to ask is one that Ariel really brings up is, can we really draw this hard and fast line between who should be allowed to stay in the country, who is following the law and who isn't? This is the workers that comprise the workforce in this region are often ones who are seeking asylum, who are seeking citizenship, who are trying to earn it, but they also have to earn a living in the meantime. And with the tightening of laws, that transition between legal residents and illegal residents is becoming much harder and less permeable than I think it was in previous years.
Okay, so Ariel, another argument, and an important one, is that many of these people, these migrants specifically, are doing jobs and filling the vacuums left where many Americans arguably would not be willing to do those sorts of tougher jobs. Is that the same case when it comes to El Paso, do you think? And then do you think that this will now, with this raid, create an atmosphere of fear where then many of those jobs may be very hard to fill?
I think that the atmosphere in El Paso is actually quite different. We are not a town that has very much separation from our sister city of Juarez, Mexico. So trans-border migration is a daily occurrence, and people go back and forth for work, for healthcare, for other things like this. There are less of these factory-oriented positions in El Paso itself that might be affected by that. That being said, it does create a climate of fear and not knowing whether or not in a public space you're going to be able to just go about your daily life. Many of these people were people who live that sort of cross-border lifestyle that is very common in El Paso, Texas, specifically.
Okay, so then let's talk then for a moment, Sascha, about how exactly does one come to a point when you have your laws in place for legal migration of some sort, some way of dealing with the situation as it is? Because, I would imagine that any country would argue that, listen, you can't just have a flow of people coming in endlessly. And obviously, it's not as Donald Trump would describe a quote-unquote invasion or otherwise, but however few, even if it's just one person a day, for example, you need some checks and balances on that. How does that work then in a logical and humane fashion then, do you think?
That's a very good question. And I think what we're facing, especially in the sort of lower level industrial manufacturing jobs that are involved in these raids, is a real contrast between political rhetoric, legal structure, and common practice. The fact of the matter is that many American industries, fruit picking is a great example, are really dependent upon this low-wage, non-unionized labor that's kept pretty much off the books. The employers of people in these circumstances are well aware that the people they're employing are marginally legal at best.
And I believe, Sascha, even some of Trump's resorts have employed such people, haven't they?
Exactly. And so the question is, okay, are you going to change the economic structure so that employers are no longer motivated to hire these workers? Or are you going to change the legal structure to make such employment a pathway to legal citizenship? But you can't have both at the same time. You can't have a manufacturing industry that is so dependent upon this labor. At the same time, you're having increasingly stern laws to prosecute. Because on one hand, you're saying, yes, come, there are jobs here. And on the other hand, you're saying, oh, but don't get caught or you're going to get jailed and deported.
Ariel, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And I understand what you were saying, Ariel, about the back and forth, and that El Paso is unique in that sense. And obviously, I haven't been to El Paso specifically when I visited Texas, but I'll take your word on it because obviously you know it better. But certainly, checks and balances for any country would be vital and important. Do you think the checks and balances in place right now are sufficient to protect, U.S. national security, or whatever arguments may be used for the need for such checks and balances?
So I want to say that our security infrastructure in the United States is some of the best in the world. And we do a lot of screenings for people coming in through legal channels. And we do have a high level of border security that goes perhaps undervalued for the amount of people that move back and forth each day. That being said, there's always room for improvement. You don't know what exactly someone's history and background is when they're coming across that border.
Yeah.
But I do feel like our current system of immigration is quite thorough and quite robust. And while it could use improvement, I don't think that it is particularly weak in the ways that Donald Trump or other perhaps Republican leaders would have you believing. I do think that there needs to be more done to address the root problems that are causing these flows of immigration, working more with our neighbors to the south and understanding their needs, and so we can support them through, funding, cross-border initiatives, things to make these issues of violence in their native country less prominent and perhaps improve the overall standing of these immigrants in their homeland so that they don't feel the need to come to the United States. That being said, I do think that there's a lot of responsibility on employers in the United States who employ these people who do have dubious legal status. And it's well known, and they're a huge part of the labor infrastructure for farming and agriculture in the United States. And those people, the owners of the businesses, are the ones who really need to be held accountable for hiring migrant laborers who may not have legal status.
Okay, just because we have a minute left, Sascha, I wanted to give you the final word. Sascha, not to take away from what's occurred in El Paso, but I wanted to hone in on another example of how the U.S. treats immigrants overall. But as you well know, Jimmy Al-Dawood, an Iraqi national who had lived in the U.S. since he was an infant, died just shortly after he was deported to Iraq as part of Trump administration's crackdown on illegal immigration. That happened because of complications, because of his diabetes, his lack of access to insulin, etc. Now, that's obviously a very tragic result of the kinds of immigration policies that are being brought in place now. Is this the first day of the rest of our lives, as we would say? Is this what the U.S. has now become?
Well, one hopes not. We have an election coming up, and with that election, there's a chance for considerable change. I would say that, in line with what I was saying before, the contrast between common practice and this increasingly tight legal regime, which is clearly targeting groups from certain countries and certain ethnicities. You don't hear about illegal Swedes getting deported, or even, for that matter, illegal Chinese residents getting deported. So these policies are targeting the vulnerable. They're targeting those upon which Trump and his allies can gain political capital with their actions. So no, I don't think this is a sign of the new norm. Unless Trump gets reelected, things will probably get worse.
Very well, Sascha. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate both time and insight, of course, and analysis. That was Sascha and Ariel speaking to us there on this important topic. Now, viewers, as both of our guests are put into context, firstly, Ariel, of course, because she is from El Paso originally, was able to describe the back and forth and just the unique sort of relationship that exists between the Mexican side and the American side when it comes to El Paso and the back and forth of the people. But of course, it's not just about that back and forth. It's also about those who are working in El Paso, living in El Paso for many years, their children, their human rights as well. Has all of that been taken into account? And is anyone really ever illegal, as Ariel put it? And that's, of course, a huge macro question which exists in all of these sorts of situations when it comes to talk of illegal immigration, quote unquote. Then, of course, there is this example of the Iraqi, as I'd put to Sascha, because it's, again, emblematic of what the U.S. is slowly becoming or has already become, that a man who lived in the U.S. since he was an infant had to be deported back to Iraq and then died because of his lack of access to insulin, simply because he didn't speak Arabic either. Is this what the United States has become? Is this what the moral authority of the world has become? We'll keep a close eye on this situation here in Scope. I'll be back after a break with the next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Well, Turkey and the U.S. have finally agreed, after 3 days of intense negotiations, to establish a joint operations center in order to set up and coordinate the setting up, I should say, of a safe zone in northern Syria. This will seemingly, at least for now, avert any Turkish operations in that region, as Turkey had warned it may carry out. Will this do enough to address Turkey's concerns about northern Syria? And of course, at the same time, as you would expect, really, the Syrian government itself of Bashar al-Assad has responded negatively to all of this, saying this is, again, further intrusion into its affairs, into its territory, into its sovereignty. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Dimosthenis Dimopoulos, who is a geopolitical analyst. He's a researcher at the Institute of International Relations. He's joining us now from Athens. We're also joined by John Hasasu, who is a political analyst, and his expertise, extensive expertise, that is on Syria. He's joining us now from Istanbul. And we're also joined by Mona Alami, who is an analyst, and she's a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's joining us now from Beirut in Lebanon. Mona, John, and Dimosthenis, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Mona, I'd like to start with you. What are your thoughts about this? Is this going to work? Because, I imagine there are a lot of question marks remaining. Will the U.S. really be able to work with Turkey in a region where the two of them have disagreed so much?
Yeah, first of all, there are several obstacles around this agreement or this operation center. The first agreement has to do with the size of the safe zone. Turkey has for weeks been pressing for a safe zone that would be from 30 to 40 kilometers deep, whereas the United States wants a 10-kilometer deep safe zone. Secondly, as you said, the U.S. and Turkey have diverging interests in this particular area. Turkey sees the Kurds establishment of an autonomous zone as a direct threat to Turkey, whereas the U.S. sees the Kurds' participation in the SDF as a very important role in countering ISIS, first of all, and possibly countering Iran in this particular region. We've also seen that previous agreements around the town of Manbij in June last year failed, and we saw that the agreement, which was known as the Manbij roadmap, was delayed multiple times. Yeah. So we do see a lot of obstacles on, surrounding this deal.
Jan, I'm glad Mona brought up the example of Manbij because, something that one can go back on to just look at it as an example of something that fell apart, really, an agreement that fell apart. Do you think that this will go the same, or do you think that this time around this may possibly actually work?
Well, actually, this is a very soft agreement between the United States and Turkey. Turkey, with this agreement, actually, I think, is trying to soften the crisis between Washington and Ankara, because they are pretty determined about what they are going to do about the threat in Syria, because the YPG, PKK, and all the threat that it causes for the Turkish national security is very serious for Ankara. So it's clear that the U.S. administration and Turkey are not they didn't get to a solid solution to the problem. So Turkey, for now, to soften the crisis, they agreed on principles, if not on some details, as if how many kilometers the safe zone is going to be, when they going to start to work. These are all unclear so far, but so far by establishing a joint operation center between the two countries, they are at least showing that they have the will to work together to solve the problem. But clearly Turkey is very determined to address these kind of problems in the region, and Manbij could be the first step for Turkey to solve this problem, because it's mainly populated by Arabs, and there are many Arab immigrants living inside Turkey willing to go back to their hometown, which is Manbij, and it's run by the SDF or the YPG-led group inside Syria right now.
Dimosthenis, there are a lot of areas of disagreement right now between Turkey and the U.S., as our other guests alluded to, of course, in their answers. We can also talk, of course, about the S-400s, not just, of course, northern Syria, as well as, the Patriot missiles, NATO, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot to talk about, really. But do you think that these two parties, i.e. the U.S. and Turkey, realize that they need to work together, even when it comes to Syria, that's what has brought them to the negotiating table, that's what has brought them to talks, to even this, as Jan put it, this soft agreement?
Well, definitely the situation between the U.S. and the Turkey relations between them have been deteriorating, further quite great degree. But the issue is that Turkey has been always using a kind of provocative, aggressive rhetoric to try to get people on the table and, get them to agree or give them some of the terms they want. That's what Turkey is doing in the Eastern Mediterranean. We see that with Cyprus and Greece, and that's what's happening there. Turkey has been threatening a new military operation in Syria since December, from what I can recall. And we have that rhetoric with military convoys going there and, troops getting to the border. And we had a situation here that you had two NATO allies, two NATO armies, threatening to attack each other. We had Turkey threatening to invade the Syrian East Syria, where the U.S. troops are stationed there. And the U.S., I think the Secretary of Defense said that we will prevent any kind of military operations there. So we had two NATO allies at the brink of war. So it's only natural, and that's what Turkey has been doing all over the region, provoking things, getting them on the cliff, where you're staring at the abyss, and then they're trying to get something out of it. That's what the tactic has been so far.
Mona, do you agree with that? Do you think that Turkey is being provocative? I mean, I imagine the Turks, for their part, Mona, would argue, listen, we're trying to secure our homeland from who we view as a terrorist group / militant group, and that we need to act, before they come over onto our side and attack us.
No, I do not think that Turkey is as one of the experts mentioned, is defending its national interest. And this requires that it has to push certain things, to push for a deal when it comes to the Kurds, especially that the number of SDF fighters is increasing. We know that there is an agreement to increase the number of SDF fighters to 110,000 fighters. They are now at 10,000. So it does view the Kurdish issue as a national interest issue for them. So they're not going to back off. I also think that any deal regarding the safe zone would also bring other problems that could create escalation, because we know that Turkey wants Turkish boots on the ground in the form of joint patrols with the U.S. and possible Arab SDF members, especially in cities such as Tel Abyad and Kobani. So the worry is that there will be some confrontation on the ground between the YPG and Turkish troops. We should expect a certain level of raids and ambush beginning. We have to see how much the U.S. will be able to maintain a lid on the situation.
That's a very good point, isn't it, John? Because, Turkey is really quite, of course, gung-ho about this issue. It's quite strong on this issue. But do you think it's prepared for what may be coming, in the sense of there will be some blowback, will there not, from the YPG and others?
Well, actually, Turkey is already dealing with YPG PKK and all the threats that it's causing. They are constantly running an operation on the Iraqi-Turkish border, and they are running other operations inside Turkey against the organization. And they just lost a diplomat in Erbil in an assassination conducted by PKK members as well. So all the training and the weapons these people are using in this kind of new style attacks against Turkey concerns the Turkish security forces, and they are involving in this kind of military actions against PKK or previously against
But John,
Daesh
if I may for a moment, I apologize for interrupting you, but this just came to my mind. It can be argued, though, John, isn't it, that Turkey may have provoked all of this?
Provocation, I think, Turkey is the last country to use this word for, because all the countries inside Syria now, if we use the invasion word, who are inside Syria, they don't have borders to Syria. Turkey has a 900-kilometer plus borderline to Syria, with Daesh, with YPG controlled areas, with all other groups which Turkey has to deal for its own internal security. So, and it's hosting almost 4 million Syrian people inside its borders. So Turkey is involved in this problem, and it's being affected directly by the problem. So its actions against, France is bombarding ISIS targets. America is bombarding ISIS targets. Russian army, Iranian army is involved in the crisis with its forces inside. Turkey, as a bordering country, has to take a measure against all these threats. So what so far Turkey has done in the region, and I think Afrin and the Euphrates Shield operation area is a good example. They are entering and trying to help the local Syrians to have their own environment, to live in dignity, and to present themselves, because Turkey is trying to gain some territory for the Syrian opposition. So if within the coming days, if there is going to be a talk, the opposition needs to have a ground. And
okay, John, I'm going to come in just because I want to give Dimosthenis the final word, if you allow, because we have a minute left for this conversation. Dimosthenis, what are your thoughts about all of these? Even as John, they're listed out. Actually, there are a lot of obviously players in Syria, aren't they? It's not just Turkey, of course, and the United States and Iran and Russia, and the list is already endless at some times. Can all of these countries actually put Syrian sovereignty and Syrian national interests first at some point in time in the near future? Because it just seems like the more the days go ahead, the more all of these countries seem almost entrenched in Syria.
I think I want to quickly state that Russia and Iran are there because they have been invited by the official government. So that's a very good, big distinction between what other countries are doing there. But to come to your question, I think that's probably not going to happen, because everybody has been involved in Syria because of their own personal interests in the region and in the country specifically. The U.S. troops, the Turkey, the Israelis, the Russians, the Iranians. So I don't think that's the case. I don't think it will happen soon. But what I also want to state is that with Turkey at the moment, the issue with the Kurds, we had for a short period of time, Erdogan had extended an olive branch towards the Kurds. When the elections happened, I think in 2015, when he lost them because of the choices of the Kurds, then he turned back on them. So you stated earlier that this is kind of a thing that Erdogan kind of provoked with himself. And we see now lately in the reports that we have people from the refugees, almost 4 million refugees living in Turkey. Many of them are being deported back to Syria and specifically to areas held by Turkey.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up point, Dimosthenis, because that is a conversation I do have at some point in time later on here on Scope, and we'll try to have the three of you back on to continue that discussion, because that is also an important topic, in fact. But I'll thank our guests for now. That was Dimosthenis, John, and Mona speaking to us about about Turkey and the U.S. coming to this agreement to set up a joint operations center to then be able to manage the setting up of a safe zone in northern Syria, to be able to then avert possibly Turkish operations in that region. Will Turkey be satisfied with this, as John described it, soft agreement? Is this going to be enough to convince Turkey to not get more involved in northern Syria as an on the ground or otherwise, or will it still go ahead with all of that and be further involved in Syria? Of course, Syrian government, the official government, that is Bashar al-Assad at least, is unhappy with all of the above being involved. We'll keep a close eye on that situation in northern Syria here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela and how Nicolas Maduro's government has walked away from talks, for the moment at least, considering the tough U.S. sanctions which have just been placed. Now, obviously, the timing of all of this does seem like the U.S. is trying to essentially try to deflect from those talks and try to create a wedge in those talks itself, especially considering Juan Guaido has actually welcomed these sanctions, which Michelle Bachelet, mind you, of the United Nations, she's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I should say, she has expressed concern about these latest sanctions specifically, saying that these will make life significantly worse for Venezuelans who are already suffering under several rounds of sanctions. Now, of course, the U.S. always claims that when sanctions are placed, they're placed on governments, but not on people. But of course, people are the ones that suffer the most. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Jesus Rodriguez-Espinoza, who is a former Venezuelan consul general in Chicago, and he's founder and editor of OregonTribune.com. He's joining us now from the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. Jesus, thanks for joining us here in Scope. What are your thoughts about Maduro walking away from the talks? Was that the right move?
I think it was the right move. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. And yes, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions analyzing this latest decision from Maduro, but actually a lot of grassroots Chavistas were very concerned about the direction that Maduro's policy towards the regime change operation led by the U.S. and here locally by Guaido was taken. So initially, a lot of Venezuelans and Chavistas like me were happy with the soft-hand approach of Maduro. Because that helped detect inner circle traders inside Maduro inner circle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that helped a lot. But at this point, especially after the latest sanction approved by President Trump, and also especially after a decision taken by a U.S. court seizing the assets of Citgo in the U.S. to pay the debt, that started making a lot of noise especially among Chavistas here in Venezuela about Maduro's approach. So this decision, if you ask me, is very well seen by.
Okay, so then, Jesus, then what does this mean, talks then? Does that mean that negotiations are just stalled, that they will not continue? Because, everyone was talking about how well these negotiations were going. The fact that this round was continuing, Norway as the mediator also seemed happy.
Yes, I believe, if you ask me, I'm among the ones that analyzing all the facts. I'm sure that the U.S. has been always against that negotiation. And of course, the media always reflects, especially the mainstream media, reflects the U.S. position. So the media was always cautious, the mainstream media, about those negotiations. And also they tried to kind of play like different roles between the media, the U.S. government, the local opposition here, and even the European Union. For example, the European Union have this contact group that sometimes it's portrayed in the mainstream media like a nice and middle point approach, which is not true, because the Venezuelan government, Maduro's government, since the beginning, rejected most of the proposals from this contact group, because basically most of the proposals were based on the Maduro have to leave. We need to have immediate elections in order to start any negotiations. So that's the European contact group approach that Maduro's government rejected since the beginning.
So why not have the elections immediately? I mean, what's holding back? If that's what's being called for, Jesus, what's the big deal? Why not just go into these elections at this time and just see who Venezuelans really want to rule the country?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm among the Chavistas that believe that at this level of stress, economic and political distress in Venezuela, it might be a good option. But I also know that there's a lot of Chavista base that says why I should go to an election again if I already voted for Maduro in the last elections of May 2018. So the problem is that for those elections, a big chunk of the opposition decided not to participate because they were already in the regime change plan led by the U.S. But a lot of Chavistas do not agree in going to an election just to please the U.S. or just to please the Venezuelan right-wingers. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. But then, Jesus, you're a Chavista, so I'll ask you, though, because Guaido and the opposition do have significant support within the country, don't they? So it's not like, it's just, a huge conspiracy where it's just somebody from the complete outside has swooped in and has tried to do something. It's people within the country as well do support this man. So how does then one deal with that situation? These are your own Venezuelan fellow countrymen. How does one deal with that then and satisfy them as well as citizens?
I believe that what you say is true in terms of there's a lot of opposition against Maduro's government or the way he has been handling the government. But that's one scene, and another scene is saying that there's a lot of support to Guaido. It's quite different.
Okay.
And so because the opposition here in Venezuela is very, disregarding what the media say, is very fragmented. So it's not easy, but to say that that Guaido is the leader that every anti-Chavista in Venezuela support. But anyway, I believe that what you say is true, and to try to get rid of all the distress that we have been living for the last few months, or maybe years, it would be better to have and if you ask me, I believe that Maduro have that on as an option in the negotiation table in the Norway talks, what we call the Norway talks. So I believe that was an option.
Okay, so Jesus, I'm going to ask you a direct question, Jesus, if I may. Do you think that Nicolas Maduro has been a good leader? Because, many would argue that after Hugo Chavez, it was very hard for anybody, even somebody like Maduro, who was, of course, a Chavez ally, to come into power and follow up on the person and the leadership of Hugo Chavez, who I would imagine it'd be hard for anybody to follow up that kind of leadership. Do you think that he was put in a position which, no one of us would envy, considering he had to follow up on somebody like Chavez? Or do you think he has actually made some major mistakes?
I believe that like any human being, Maduro has committed a lot of mistakes, but I also believe that he have taken good decisions, especially in the political scope. If you ask me in the economic scope, I believe that Maduro have committed a lot of economic mistakes. Economic policy mistakes. But that's one sin, and another sin is not recognizing that disregarding Maduro or whoever is in the presidency or in the leadership of the Chavista movement. What matters is, one of the things that matter the most is that Maduro have a hardcore Chavista progressive support that most of the media outside Venezuela do not reflect, and I believe that is important, and that's what we try to do in the website that we manage to present to show outside Venezuela what the Chavista movement means, what the Bolivarian revolution means.
All right, we say thank you there to Jesus Rodriguez-Espinoza, former diplomat who is speaking to us from the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. As Jesus there mentioned, and of course, he gave the point of view of the Chavistas, or the pro-Maduro side, but there is the other side, of course, of the argument as well, and that is on the side of Guaido and the opposition, which is, as Jesus there said, to be fair, fragmented at this time, even though they are being supported by the U.S. through funds and other such means. There is talk, of course, about these U.S. sanctions, Michelle Bachelet being concerned about the effect that this will have on people in Venezuela who have already been suffering for a significant amount of time now. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation and how it plays out on the ground there in Venezuela here in Scope. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.